Hello everyone, my name is Ian, you're watching Big Rock Moto, and thank you so much for tuning in today. Now, first, I apologize for my voice in today's video. It's going to seem a little bit off because I've been fighting a cold for over a week now, and I'm definitely ready for this cold to end, but I can't stop video production just because I'm a little bit sick. So, I've had a ton of questions over the past couple of years about how I capture good-looking motorcycle footage. Capturing good-looking footage and good-sounding audio when you're riding a motorcycle is actually a lot more technically challenging than it might seem on the surface. And if any of you have tried doing this, you'll definitely know that there are a lot of pitfalls and a lot of problems you run into right away. So here's what you can expect in today's video. I'm going to talk about the different types of cameras that I use. Notably, I'm going to talk about GoPro Hero9, and I'm going to talk about the Instacam 1X2 360 camera. We're going to talk about different ways of mounting your camera. So how do you mount your camera to your helmet? What are the best ways to do that? And I've definitely learned the wrong ways to do it. Also, we're going to talk about how do you mount cameras to a motorcycle. So whether you want to mount like a 360 camera and capture that kind of footage, or whether you want to mount a GoPro on your handlebars and capture footage of you riding from that perspective, we're going to cover all that. So we're going to head out to the garage and take a look at how we do that and talk about some of these different RAM mounts that I've found to be very, very useful. We're also going to talk a lot about audio. So capturing good audio is probably the hardest part of all of this, because you can imagine the acoustic environment inside a motorcycle helmet when you're traveling at highway speeds is incredibly challenging. So blocking out the wind and where to position a microphone and what kind of microphone to use is a big topic of discussion. So we're going to cover all that in today's video. And then finally, when we're done with all that, I'm going to give you some very basic editing, or what we call post-processing tips. I'm not going to go through how to edit videos, how to deal with your footage. There's way too much. It would take hours to really talk about that. But I'll give you some basic tips for how to make your GoPro or your Instacam footage look and sound better in your editing. All right, so let's talk about what sort of cameras you should consider using to capture motorcycle footage. So over the years, I've tried a lot of different things. GoPros are really one of the most important items in my camera equipment bag. So right now I'm using GoPro 9 Blacks. I bought 2 of them because they were a good deal. I usually like to run a GoPro that is one generation behind the current or latest one, because I find that they really price gouge for the latest one. And oftentimes the previous generation, in this case the 9 Black, at the time I'm filming this, the previous generation is a much, much better value. It's like hundreds of dollars less. So that's something I recommend. The other camera that I'm going to talk about today is the Instacam. So 360 cameras are becoming a really big deal. And this Insta360 1X2, which they actually sent out to me a whole motorcycle filming kit. So thank you very, very much, Instacam, you guys, for doing that. We'll talk about how you can use this to capture that really cool looking 360 footage, which can be very, very useful. So coming back to the GoPros for a second, over time, GoPro has really improved their image quality and their image stabilization. So one of the reasons that a lot of us who do action sports photography use GoPros is because when the camera's shaking, like on the front of a motorcycle helmet here, it provides a level of stabilization that allows you to have a smooth picture. The other thing that GoPro has improved over the years has been the resolution. So now I think the new ones capture maybe like 5K or 8K. I record in 4K, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But being able to crop a little bit and still have a good quality 4K footage is a really, really nice thing to have, because you definitely want to be publishing in 4K, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The other reasons to stick with sort of the mainstream cameras, either GoPros or the Instacams, is that the landscape for the mounts and different sort of accessories is huge. So everything from these little screw-in things that you need to the different mounts you can put on helmets, to mounts for your motorcycles, chin mounts, tripods, extensions, all sorts of things. They're pretty universal, and they're kind of everywhere for these cameras. So that's why I like using a mainstream camera that a lot of people use, because there's a ton of interchangeable accessories for them, and you're definitely going to need those accessories. Now let's talk let's come back to the GoPro again for a second. So you see this shell here, it's not really just a case. What this is something called a media mod. Now for the newer GoPros, the 9s and the 10s, it looks like this. It's got this external microphone with this fuzzy thing you can go ahead and snap off here, which I usually do. But the camera inserts into this as a case. It connects to the USB port there. That might even get lined up. So you insert it like this, you snap it shut, and now you have the ability to plug in an external microphone. And we're going to get to that because you need to plug in an external mic that's wired into your helmet. The media mod's also very useful because if you're vlogging or blogging or whatever you want to do, you're on a tripod or a little selfie stick, the microphone here is much better than the built-in microphone inside the GoPro. So it's also useful even if you're not using the external mic connection. So let's talk about GoPro settings for just a second. So I'm not going to go into this a ton because it could take forever. But when you go into the menu of the GoPro, you're going to want to set your resolution and frame rate to 4K, at the minimum of 4K. But I use that because the larger resolutions take up a lot more image size. And for frame rate, I typically shoot at 30 frames a second just to keep everything consistent. Now, the reasons why you might sometimes want to shoot at 60 frames a second, which I occasionally do, is if you want to get really smooth looking slow motion footage, like let's say a picture of a tire like spinning up dirt, then you're going to want to bump your setting up to 60 frames a second so that when you slow that footage down, it's still going to look nice and smooth. So that's a tip for you there. But typically 30 is good. And a lot of bloggers use 24 frames. It's just personal preference. 24 looks a little bit more cinematic and 30 can look a little bit smoother. If you guys watch Itchy Booch's videos, you might notice that she uses 60 frames a second, which gives a very smooth, kind of realistic look to the footage, which some people really like. Couple other things to note on the settings of the GoPro. One important thing is that I set my exposure compensation, basically the brightness that the camera is recording, I set it to -1/2 stop. So by setting it to -1/2, you can preserve some of the highlights in the image. Otherwise, cameras tend to overexpose a little bit and you'll get the sky looking like white and you won't be able to correct that. If you underexpose a little bit, you can bring up the shadows in post-processing, but just preserve your highlights by underexposing by 1/2. Now make sure also you have your stabilization setting turned up to the most stabilization that it offers in that mode. Now one thing that I haven't talked about yet is the field of view. So GoPro gives you an option for do you want super view, do you want wide, do you want linear, and things like that. Usually when I'm shooting on the helmet, like here, or like in this, you can see in this footage here, and in this image, that is the super view, and it gives you the widest possible angle of what's happening in the scene. So I typically will stick with that for shooting on-camera footage. Now, if you're shooting footage of a person, like you're doing an interview or you're shooting off the bike, you might want to go to linear or one of the other fields of view because the super view tends to make things look, give it kind of a fisheye effect, and it can look a little bit weird. So just keep that in mind. So the other camera that I've started to incorporate in my filming over the past 6 months or so is this Instacam 1X2 360 camera. So in summary, what a 360 camera does, you mount it at any perspective. And I have the lens cover on here, I pop this off. But what they have is they have these fisheye lenses on both sides of the camera. And what it does through some sort of magical software or whatever, it's amazing how they do this, but you could stick the camera at any angle and it captures everything within a 360 sphere of the camera. Now, a couple things to note about that. While you can get really creative angles and it gives you a lot of flexibility because you're not worried about where to aim the camera, when you process the footage, there's an extra step involved because you're going to have to go through an extra step of using their software. I think actually Adobe Premiere has this built in as well. I'm not using that function. But anyway, you'll have to process it because obviously you can't display 360 footage on an image like this that you're going to actually present for a video. So you have to choose the frame of reference that you want in the software and then export that clip that you want, however long that is, to a normal movie file, which then you can use in a production of a normal video that you're going to produce. So there is an extra processing step there, but it's still worth it. And We'll talk about this on the bike, but when using some of these like extension wands and selfie sticks and tripods, you can get some really interesting angles of you riding the motorcycle. They're also very useful in all sorts of types of outdoor sports and activities. They have a lot of different applications. They're a really wonderful addition and definitely worthwhile adding to your toolkit if you're going to make motorcycle videos or any sort of sports and outdoor videos. All right, so now I think we should talk about how are you actually going to mount the camera to your helmet. So I'm going to show you a couple different kinds of helmets here. All right, so let's look at a couple different helmets and ways you can do this. So what I want to talk about first, this is called a chin mount. Now, first let's talk about why do you want to use a chin mount. So I've tried mounting cameras up on top of the helmet like this. I've tried mounting cameras off to the side, and those, I do not recommend that whatsoever because it gives the wrong perspective, because what you're trying to do with motorcycle footage is put the viewer into your eyes. So you want the camera to be as close to your line of sight as possible so that when they're viewing the footage, like here, they're actually getting the experience of being on the motorcycle with you. If you put the camera up on top of the helmet or to the side, not only does it make the whole motorcycle in front of you look weird because it's at a weird perspective, it just throws everything off. So just forget that and just go right to a chin mount. Now, there's a few different kinds or brands of chin mounts out there, and ultimately, I don't care which ones you use, but I'll tell you which ones I've used and that work for me. So the first mount is from a company called Wannabes, and they were nice enough to send me out some of their mounts. I actually met the owner of the company, and you can see that here on the Climb Cryos Pro. I also have some of their other mounts, but the nice thing about the Wannabes mount is that it's custom made, it's custom printed, 3D printed for a specific helmet. So it comes with the adhesive pads, you just stick it on and you're good to go. So that's a nice quality mount that really puts the camera in a good position. It also spaces the camera out a little bit from the helmet because the reason for that is if you think about the angle, you actually need this to be angled up, but we'll talk about that when we go out and sit on the motorcycle. I've also tried some of these universal mounts. So this one is a 2U brand. This is like an Amazon thing. So these will have adhesive backing here, which just doesn't show. You can see it mounted here to my street helmet. And these can be good for more universal applications if you have a helmet that doesn't, where either Wannabes or a company like Chin Mounts doesn't have a specific mount. And they tend to work pretty well, like on the street helmet here, it mounts really, really securely, and I'm pretty happy with that design. These are 20 or 30 bucks on Amazon and useful to have around. So you've got a few different options for the chin mounts, but you might need some adapters to make sure that, again, that you have enough space here to angle this camera as you need it to angle it. All right, so let's look at how a few of these things play out in real life on the motorcycle. So I first want to talk about the angle of the camera on the helmet. You can see here that the angle actually, because, well here, let me just put the helmet on and show you what I'm talking about. So the camera needs to be angled. If you angle the camera this kind of level with the helmet, you're going to just get a picture of the dashboard. Because when you ride a motorcycle, your helmet actually angles down like this. So you actually need the camera to be tilted up quite a bit like this here in order for this to work. Now, here's what I recommend. What you want to do is use the preview function in the GoPro app on your phone, or somehow just check your footage to experiment to make sure you're getting the right angle, and make sure when you do that that you're actually in the position of riding and actual test it when you're riding, because you're not going to be staring at the dashboard when you're out on the highway. So make sure that you actually test it in a real world situation. All right, so how do you actually mount cameras to a motorcycle? So there's a few different ways you can approach this. Some people like to use the little stick-on mounts that every GoPro comes with. You could stick them to a headlight mask, a fender, gas tank. However, be very, very careful using those. I find that they don't bond very well, and it's easy for them to shake off, and then you have a $400 camera rolling down the highway at 70 miles an hour, which is a very bad day. So be very careful if you're going to use any of the adhesive mounts. I very rarely use them because I just find they don't adhere that well. Other ways around that. Ram mounts are the answer to almost everything because they make the clamp mounts like this. They make all these extension arms and different sockets you can get. So this clamp mount I use a lot. So like on this DRZ, what I could do, and what I will do when I film this bike, probably next week, is I can clamp this down to the bar here and then run these ram arms and get my camera, you know, in the perfect position that I want. And I can move it around, I can put it somewhere else. You can also use these suction cup mounts like to mount to like a mirror. Like I could mount this here on this mirror, and they're pretty strong. The Ram mount brand only, don't try off-brand stuff. So that's another thing you could do, maybe mount it to a windshield. These things really stick on. So these can be really good. And again, make sure you're getting a good angle, so check it in your phone in your preview function, or just make sure you're getting the right angle that you want. Sometimes you need to use extra arms to get the camera a little bit further out in front of you so that it gets a good perspective of you when you're riding. Now, let's talk about the Instacam for a second. So the Instacam is versatile because you can get shots like almost outside the bike. So here's how you would do that. So I'd use one of these ram mounts here, and I use these clamp mounts. I can mount it to an engine bar, I can mount it to the frame, I can mount it to the handlebar. You have to be careful with this kind of thing, but if you want to position the camera kind of in an interesting angle that would allow you to get the perspective of you riding the motorcycle almost as if someone was filming you, what you can do is use these extension sticks and put the camera like out here. Now, it's pretty challenging to do this because this wants to move around, which shakes it. Also, this is a bit dangerous. You could hit stuff when you're riding, so be very, very careful if you're going to try something like this. Start with a shorter distance first and see how that goes. You can also try putting the camera up really high, or you can try putting it behind you, like on the luggage rack. So try different angles and just be super, super careful. Use a really sturdy mount, tighten it down really well. And you know, don't ride in like traffic or something with this sticking way out to the side if you're going to hit somebody. But this is a way to get some really interesting footage. All right, so capturing good audio when you're riding a motorcycle is definitely, I think, maybe the biggest challenge of all of this. If you've ever tried doing motorcycle vlogging, you know what I'm talking about. So first off, you might think, well, you can use an external microphone like that's mounted on a GoPro Media Mod or something like that. Well, that's really only going to work if you're riding at like maybe, 20 miles per hour or under. So if you're doing like single track dirt bike riding, you might get away with using the microphone on this. But otherwise, if you're riding at any sort of highway speeds with any sort of wind hitting your helmet, you're going to need to use a microphone inside of your helmet. So what kind of microphone should you use? Now, before I go any further, there's a couple different approaches you can look at here. People like Yami Noob and a lot of other vloggers will use a dedicated audio recorder like a Tascam with a microphone similar to this, and then they'll sync up all the footage later when they do the processing. However, the way I do it is a little more convenient because I capture the audio directly into the GoPro file using a microphone input on the Media Mod. So there's ups and downs to both approaches. Using the separate recorder might give you a little better quality, but it's going to add another step of syncing things up in another file you have to worry about in your processing. Doing it on the camera is a little bit more convenient, so that's what I'm doing for now. Now, in terms of what microphone you should use, I've tried a number of different lavalier style microphones. Lavalier mic is just something like this that's designed, usually you clip it on your shirt. Like I'm wearing a wireless lav mic right now from Rode, which is what I use for studio recording. It's a much more expensive setup, but that's a separate topic. For motorcycle helmets, what you want to get, what I recommend is this Purple Panda mic, and I have no affiliation with them, but I saw some recommendations from other motovloggers that they said this worked out really well. So I tried it, and I agree, it captures pretty good audio. Now, what do you need to know about this? So the thing you need to know is these little fuzzy wind socks, some people call them dead cats, some people call them wind jammers, I don't care what you call it, but these are absolutely essential. And you can even see I'm wearing one on my studio mic just because any little breath of wind hitting a microphone without this dead cat is going to create distortion in the audio. So this is the one that the Purple Panda comes with. In the Climb helmet, I have actually a different dead cat. You can't really see it on camera because it's buried up inside here. But I experiment. That's one of the things you have to realize with this is you have to experiment to try to get this try to improve your footage, right? So the way you're going to do this is you're going to basically use something like Gorilla Tape or duct tape and duct tape the microphone inside the chin bar as close to your mouth as possible without actually like touching your mouth, because this kind of fur being on your on your face is going to get really frustrating. So you can stick the wiring like under the cheek pad here in the helmet and route the microphone to the very front of the helmet and use some duct tape. And what I've actually found is that if you duct tape or Gorilla Tape over the actual wind cat itself, at least most of it, leaving a little bit exposed, that can actually help provide another wind blocking layer. But essentially, you're going to put this right in here in front of the helmet, inside the chin bar, and tape it in place. Secure the wiring inside the cheek pad, and then you're going to route the wiring. I usually route the wiring coming out. I cut a little hole in the chin curtain. I also recommend using a chin curtain. You can buy these for your helmets. This helps block more wind getting into the helmet, which disrupts your audio. Wire the wire outside here so that it's ready to be plugged into the GoPro camera. So obviously the quieter your helmet is, the better this is going to come out. So avoid using like a dirt bike helmet. Dual sport helmets are a little bit louder, but I do find that the Cryos Pro is quiet enough to get pretty decent footage. Again, a lot of it's going to come down to blocking the wind coming up from the bottom of the helmet. So have a helmet that fits properly. Use the chin curtains. You can see I've got chin curtains on both my helmets here. You can see the wiring on the Cryos Pro. And get the microphone as close to your mouth as possible because you want the relative sound of your narration louder than the sound of the wind or the bike. So that's if you think about it that way. Now, if you just want to capture, if you don't care about narrating or speaking, and you just want to capture the sound of the engine or the exhaust, there's a lot of different options that would open up. You could put the helmet in a backpack or inside of a jacket or behind you, or there's all different ways to do it if you're trying to capture the sound of the motorcycle's engine. But you're still going to have the problem of wind noise, so definitely use the wind jammers and protect the microphone from a really windy or turbulent location. Now the question comes up of how do you synchronize your audio? So let's say you're recording, as I often do, with one camera on the handlebar capturing your helmet and another camera like on the helmet. Well, the way to do that is simply clap, and then you can line up the audio files by zooming in your video editing software and get that audio synced up. It's pretty easy to do once you really think about it. One final thing about audio is you see how helmets have usually a chin vent that you can open and close. A lot of times, especially on a dual sport helmet like this would direct wind right onto the microphone. You don't want that. So make sure that when you're recording that you go ahead and shut down the chin vent so that you're not blowing extra wind right on the mic. So now that you've downloaded your footage from your cameras and you're working in your video editing software, whether you use like a free program, whether you use DaVinci Resolve or Adobe Premiere Pro, and I've used all of the above, and I think they all have their ups and downs. When you're doing that, there's a few things to keep in mind just at a very basic level of making your footage look better. So whether I'm working with the GoPro footage or the Instacam footage or any footage for that matter, even a studio shot like I'm doing right now with my expensive camera, there's a few things you can do. Shadows and highlights are a big deal. So in a lot of scenes, what you're going to see is something like, you know, a bright sky and maybe a darker road or a darker motorcycle or whatever's in the picture, just like here. So what you can do is sometimes you can use the shadow and highlight adjustment tool in your color correction area, depending on what software you have, bring down the highlights a little bit and bring up the shadows a little bit. That'll tend to make the picture have something called more dynamic range. So it'll look like a little bit more real life instead of like those, when you see footage like with the sky that's all white and the foreground's all like black, you can make it look a little bit more what we call dynamic range by, you know, bringing down the highlights and bringing up the shadows. Another thing you can do is adjust your color temperature. So if something looks too cool or too warm, you can adjust that in post-processing. Another thing I like to do to the footage is add a little bit of sharpness. So I usually have the sharpness setting on normal in the GoPros or the Instacams, but in post-processing, I like a little sharper look to the footage. So I'll go ahead and bump up the sharpening a little bit. And you can go down the rabbit hole in terms of the processing and take forever doing this, different setups, and you can set presets and you can get good at it. And this is why editors, like, they have their own jobs. It's like a whole industry. But again, perfection is the enemy of getting something done. So don't worry about being perfect. Just try to make your footage look a little bit better than it comes out of the camera. Let's talk about editing the audio. So when you're editing the audio portion of the clips, this is the most important thing of all. Because if you have bad audio, whether it's too quiet or in most cases it's way too loud and like way too much wind noise and overblown and the audio is what we call clipping or reaching the max level, that's going to be a horrible video even if you have beautiful cinematic looking footage. So there's a couple things to realize when you're editing your audio. You need to be consistent across your whole final movie file. So you're going to be bringing in clips from different scenes, different cameras, whatever it might be. You want to make sure that you have a consistent overall output across all clips so that you have something called like a source monitor panel in your video editing program that'll show you where those audio levels are peaking up to. And usually want to target around -9 to -6 decibels. So how that's really going to work in your processing is you're going to, when you bring in each clip, you're going to look and see where the audio levels are peaking at. Normally, these cameras are going to record much too high of a level of audio. So you're going to drop that level down to make sure that everything is at a decent level. Now, there's ways in the software to like, do what they call peak balancing or different ways to bring everything down, but I do things manually just to make sure that every clip I'm getting the right level of audio. The other thing you can do if you want to get fancy is you can go into equalizers and reduce the lower frequency noises, which could be the wind roar, the wind buffeting. But that gets really tricky and can add a lot of extra time, so that's just going to be up to you. The most important thing is make sure that your audio is consistent across your whole movie and that your clips are not clipping and peaking out over the limit so that you get distortion. Let's talk real briefly about when you're exporting the footage. So whatever software you use is going to be a feature that allows you to export your final file. A couple things you want to keep in mind there. Resolution. Whatever resolution you're using, just remember that if you shoot in 1080 but you export in 4K, well, that's upsampling and it's probably not going to look very good. So make sure that if you want to export in 4K that you're capturing your footage in 4K or above for the best result. The other thing is you have to understand how YouTube deals with bit rates, and this could change sometime in the future depending on when you're watching this. But as I'm filming this now, what I learned is that if I have really good footage and I do 1080p, if I upload a 1080p file, YouTube limits the bit rate on that file. So what it does is it compresses it and the footage will not look as good as when you captured it or when you looked at it in your editing software. So the trick is to use a higher resolution even if you don't really want to or don't think you need to. So everything nowadays I do is either in 1440, which is like halfway between high def and 4K, or I just use 4K, which I do most of the time now. Then YouTube has a higher bitrate limit, which allows the footage to not be compressed and lose the quality. So just that's something that I've really learned the hard way. So I think to summarize my sort of lessons here about what I've learned motovlogging, if you want to do good motorcycle videos, it has to be a combination of being able to tell a story or have some sort of narrative to impart to people that's interesting. But also it brings in the technical skills as well, because if your footage looks all jerky or if your audio is horrible, it's not going to matter how good of a story you have to tell. But also, if you have really beautiful footage but you have no story to tell or no real point to your video, nobody's going to care about watching it. I don't care how many drones you have or how many cinematic shots you have, unless you have something of value to offer the audience, then people are not going to spend time watching the video. A lot of people take long clips of them riding a certain trail because they know when they're riding the trail, it's like, oh, this is the hard trail, it's really impressive, I feel like I'm doing something cool. But the truth is, the video will never reflect how hard the trail was or how cool you are or however it looked. It's never going to show that. So it's more important to tell a story than to try to impress people with your riding abilities. That's just not really going to work out that well that way. And also the other tip I have is that don't always run your cameras all the time. I see people who just run cameras for hours and hours. You're going to end up with, terabytes and terabytes of footage that really have no point. And sorting through it, what do you use and why are you doing that? The only time I have my cameras running is when there's something really interesting happening, really good scenery, or I'm telling some sort of story. Otherwise, the cameras are not running. That's going to save you a lot of time and aggravation in the long run. And nobody wants to watch 20 minutes of you riding the same trail just on and on and on with no real point. Nobody wants to see that. So just keep that in mind. If you have questions, comments, constructive criticism, or criticism that's not constructive, whatever you want to have, put that down in the comments below, and I'll make sure to answer all your comments. As always, links to the products I've talked about are in the description below. So let me know if you have any questions about any of them. And keep in mind, all this stuff is changing. Every year it's changing. That's why this video is like the 2022 version. Next year, who knows? Maybe I'll find a better setup. Technology moves on. That's how the world is. But otherwise, I really hope you guys found this useful. I hope you found it informative. If it is, please support Big Rock Moto, and there's a ton of ways to do that in the description below. Otherwise, please ride safe, and I'll see you out there. Capturing good moto vlogs or footage while you're riding your motorcycle is actually a pretty good... All right, so now we need to talk about how do you mount